Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Conor Sheedy, and I represent the NATO Strategic Direction South Hub, or the NSDS Hub. And we're here today with Martin Novella. And our topic of conversation today in our Southern Talks program is Iran's growing defense industry. Welcome to you, Martin.
Thank you, Conor. Thank you for having me. It's very nice to be here.
There's a slight delay because we're talking to Martin from Buenos Aires, and we're very privileged to have you here with us today. Martin is currently the Director of Anti-Competitive Concerted Practices at Argentina's National Competition Commission, or the CNDC. His background is as a defense economist and independent researcher specializing in global defense industries, acquisition policies, and defense industrial strategy. He previously served as National Director of Defense Industrial Policy at Argentina's Ministry of Defense, and as Head of Operations Planning at Argentina's state-owned Military Manufacturing Directorate, or DGFM. Martin has lectured at Argentina's National Defense University and contributed as an external researcher for the Rabdan Institute for Security and Defense Studies. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Buenos Aires and a master's degree in political economy from the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences. So today we are going to discuss, as I mentioned earlier, Iran's growing defense industry. And Martin, I wonder, could we begin by perhaps, could you outline the main features of Iran's military capabilities for us?
Well, thank you again, Conor, for your kind introduction and this possibility of participating in this space. So, well, to answer your question, I think it's best to make a very brief introduction about the kind of like the historical background of the Iranian industrial military complex before its current configuration, how we got here in a sense. So most of Iranian defense companies were formed during the Shah's rule in the 60s and 70s, when Iran started a series of major acquisition programs with Western companies, a lot of them with the US. And during that period, we could say that the sort of strategic approach was similar to what we have seen in most of developing countries around the world in terms of their military industrial policies. That is, doing what we would now call offset agreements, or kind of co-production or license production agreements, in order to increasingly localize industrial capabilities through acquisition projects with more advanced Western international companies in this case. So during that period, a number of these Iranian companies, some of which still exist today, were formed through some of these joint ventures. Like, for example, Iran's electronic industries made a deal with the British Aerospace for developing missiles. With Hughes Aerospace, the Iran aircraft manufacturing industries also did a joint venture with Textron for helicopters. And also Iran's aircraft manufacturing industries, which is also called HESA in the Iranian acronym, did a joint venture with Northrop Grumman. So many of these were kind of like laid the foundations for what would later be the current, Iranian military industries. So, of course, this situation changed with the revolution in '79, where kind of like this usual path that we see in most countries, even today, was cut, of course. Later on, sanctions were placed, so Iran was cut off from accessing foreign technology, and a drastic reorientation of their approach had to be done. So they started, of course, this path to indigenous production. I would say in a more forced than thought out manner. And they started to reorganize their defense industrial companies. Of course, some years later, after the revolution, the war with Iraq began. And during that war, Iran suffered heavy losses. Their military was not very well prepared for this situation. So the war was also another important event that kind of made them rethink how they should approach their military industrial production. So I would say that the summation of both the sanctions and the events of the war kind of form their current strategic approach, that is basically to heavily focused on a more narrow scope of capabilities, asymmetric capabilities to be developed, right? So like they in a way having to sacrifice access to more modern technology and having to have it developed locally. They concentrated their efforts on a particular set of systems that gave them a more, asymmetric effects than maybe continuing the path of developing the whole array of military systems such as tanks and aircraft and naval surface vessels and all of that. So they started to focus on basically missile productions to be the main technological area to have developed, and while they continued some other projects, but mostly in the way of upgrades and modernizations, and in some cases more like propaganda efforts, would say, in terms of showing that they are developing maybe an advanced tank or an advanced aircraft, but it's really more just like a way to show that they have an effective military industry, but while their real advancements are concentrated in the missile area. And then later on, as decades went on, started also to focus on the UAV technological area, which I will address maybe a little later. But just to more concisely now answer your question, I would say that during this period, as I was saying, in the 80s, after the revolution, they reorganized their industrial companies, all of them state-owned, as it is in many of Middle Eastern countries and many other countries around the world. And they were basically put under the control of the Ministry of Defense and Armed Forces Logistics, which is usually referred to as MODAFL, which is the acronym, which is the ministry that depends of course, of the president of Iran. It does not depend on the commander of the armed forces. And this peculiar configuration has that the Ministry of Defense does not control the armed forces. The armed forces and the Islamic Revolutionary Armed Corps, the IRGC, are both under the Supreme Leader's command, while the Ministry of Defense mostly focuses on the support functions and the military industrial complex. So all of the Iranian military industries are under MODAFL, with some kind of footnotes I will make a little later about the role of IRGC also in military industrial production. But the large conglomerates are under MODAFL, and they are organized in a way similar also to many other defense complexes around the world, divided between kind of broad technological areas, which are common to each of these kind of holding organizations, basically around the land domain, the air domain, the naval domain, the missile domain, the electronics domain, and then with some companies providing more cross-functional support in areas such as R&D, defense R&D, technical education, exports, and well, this type of more support functions to the rest of the organization. So, I mean, each of these companies, well, I should also begin by saying that one of the ways in which this is a peculiar way of organizing their defense industry is that, unlike many other countries, they have concentrated under one roof both the acquisition organization, which is the ministry, and the supply production organization, which are the companies. So, like many other countries that do have state-owned enterprises, have divided this control and placed their military companies under other ministries like industry ministry or some maybe even the presidential power, in a way to divide the supply from the demand, right? So they in a way keep an older model, a more Soviet inspired model, where they concentrate supply and demand under one roof, which of course is very, probably prone to inefficiencies because of the conflict of interest you usually have when the same person is buying and supplying. So this also can explain why they continue many kind of older upgrade projects, and there's like a superabundance of projects that most of which don't really have a very clear path of success. So this type of organization is also prone to that kind of proliferation of systems and projects.
Why do you think it is that they haven't updated their approach, that they're still using a sort of an outdated and perhaps not the most effective way of doing things?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure I have a very concrete answer. I think that it's they have at some points reorganized their ministries to resolve internal conflicts. When they have, of course, the main conflict within the military organization is between the traditional armed forces, the Artesh and the IRGC, but and they also had this conflict at the civilian side in the Ministry of Defense. And in the late part of the 80s, they unified this under one roof within the Modafel that supplies all of the armed forces. I mean, I'm not sure. Maybe it's because the military is not within the Ministry of Defense itself. So you have the requirement aspect of acquisition outside the Ministry of Defense, but you still have the the acquisition, the contracting and budgeting and all of the other management processes of acquisition under the Ministry of Defense. So I'm not sure why. I guess it's kind of the result of having a very state-prone economic model, a very planned economy, although they have attempted at several instances to privatize many of these companies. In the 90s, in the 2000s, several governments have attempted to privatize, but they are usually faced with the problems of the sanctions and the isolation, and they have to kind of continue to support their state-owned companies.
Right. That was my curiosity there? Was it more to do with um, a long-standing, more traditional approach because of the structure of society, or was it because any major changes or steps forward were being held back by embargoes and sanctions? Was it by choice, or because no matter how much they tried, they were getting stopped by external actors whenever they made an effort to modernize, so maybe, or even privatize, as you mentioned?
Yeah, I think that when you see how other countries have reformed their defense industries, they usually this was mostly in the 80s and 90s, right? They usually uh, corporatize what there were, factories and arsenals started to take the way of, companies, even if they're state-owned, but kind of acting as companies. And then this type of reforms, like for example, taking them out of the defense organizations and putting them in a separate way as another competitor, faced even in some cases with competition from the outside. And what this type of reform have in common is an attempt to internationalize your defense industry, to increase their efficiency, their competitive capabilities. And Iran is continuously, unable to do this because of their international integration, the way they integrate in the world, and the sanctions that are placed. So the incentive to do this, I would say, is kind of not there. However, I was going to add that there are some interesting adaptations to this, because I would say that through the um, uh, proxy export channels that they have been developing, which is more the result of a strategic and military strategic posturing in the region, of course, to rely on proxies to create an effect against their adversaries in the region. Through that channel, they have kind of started to, in a way, creating the kind of market signals that you would otherwise have if you have a more open economy exposed to international competition. And I was going to refer to this after, but it doesn't matter. I mean, I think that it's a way for them to test their systems, to combat proven their systems, and to create an innovation feedback into their manufacturing capabilities that otherwise, it's much more difficult for them to do. Well, kind of like, as I was saying, the MODAFL, the Ministry of Defense, is organized around these major companies. Each of these companies has, in turn, is kind of like a holding, in the sense that it has a large number of different internal organizations. I guess that the main ground systems manufacturer is the Defense Industries Organization, the DIO, which is in charge of, manufacturing guns and rifles and armor vehicles, tanks and howitzers, all of this. But it also has specific companies, for example, for chemical input manufacturing, which supplies the rest of the industrial complex. And in this sense, Iran benefits from having a very well-developed petrochemical industrial base, and they are very much self-reliant on critical inputs like, nitric acid, sulfuric acid, nitrocellulose, TNT, RDX, all of the array of chemicals you need to elaborate ammunitions and explosives, some of which are scarce in the West, I might add. So it's interesting that they have that ability to be self-reliant on this. It's not a minor thing. Then you have the Marine Industries Organization, the MIO, which is in charge of manufacturing naval vessels, many of them of small tonnage, but very much effective within their strategy of proliferating small vessels to create, disruptions in the Gulf and the Red Sea. And they have also been involved in some interesting projects, like the manufacturing of some mini submarines with the aid of North Korea. There are also two other large shipbuilding industries that they are not under Modafel, interestingly, because as usually happens, shipbuilding is very much a dual purpose capability. So they have a shipbuilding company that is under the Ministry of Industry, Mines and Trade, that is also very much involved in their old oil tankers and offshore facilities building. And there's also another shipbuilding company that is under the largest construction conglomerate in Iran, which is controlled, interestingly, by IRGC. IRGC has taken, I think in the 80s, created this company, which is known as Khatam Al Anbiya, or GHROB, which is the largest construction company of Iran, in charge of many of their infrastructure projects. And this company has in turn this other shipbuilding company called Sadra. And they all kind of converge in supplying their military needs if necessary. In the air domain, one of the companies that I was referring in the beginning, created in the 60s and 70s, in Iran's Aviation Industries Organization, the IAIO, is mostly the company specialized in building the wide array of UAVs Iran has developed in recent decades. This is under a company called HESA, which is under the IAIO. And they manufacture the Ababil series of UAVs, the Shaheds UAVs, which are, the famous drones that Iran is supplying Russia, as well as all of the other, the Mohajers and all of the other wide array of UAVs they have. Then the other important company in this complex is the Aerospace Industries Organization, the AIO, which is the one in charge of missile manufacturing. And they have also specialized in different organizations within this company, the manufacturing of their different types of missiles. So they have the Shahid Hamad manufacturing ballistic liquid fuel missiles, the Shahid Bakeri manufacturing ballistic solid fuel missiles, and then Shahid Alaeme, which manufactures the cruise missiles, both surface-to-surface and anti-ship cruise missiles.
So thanks, Martin. You mentioned that Iran is relatively self-sufficient when it comes to the chemical and resources aspects of what it needs for the basic needs of much of its military production. And then you began talking about UAVs and missiles, etc. Where does it, also working with North Korea on the mini subs, but where does, considering the sanctions and embargoes, etc., where does Iran outsource the things that it can't produce for itself? Or is Iran one of those strange countries that is capable of producing everything from microchips to casings to whatever else is necessary?
Yes, well, no, I mean, I think that I mean, they certainly are not that, but what again, going back to this idea that they have specialized their military industrial capabilities around a certain specific number of areas, like as I was saying, missiles and UAVs mostly. Although they do still manufacture kind of light weaponry and all of that. Also anti-tank missiles, other types of rockets. They have a large, I would say, vertical integration in all of these areas. But what they don't have is machining, modern machining capability, which they mostly acquire from China, like CNC machining stations and this type of equipment. And then, of course, they also have a deficit in the aerospace components, modern aerospace commercial components, and specialized materials. Although they do have some composite manufacturing capabilities that they have also, been developing. But I think that one of the areas where they have been really intelligent is that, and particularly in the case of the Shahed drones, the ones that are most massively produced by Iran and through proxies such as Russia, that they have been supplying Russia. The fact is that maybe they do have some self-sufficient manufacturing capabilities of some systems, but when they are developing these low-cost, mass-produced drones, they don't attempt to substitute all of the components, but rather they have a network of shadow and kind of smuggling companies around the world in many countries, that they procure this in many cases Western developed aerospace components, which are manufactured for the civilian market in a much more efficient and low-cost manner, and they integrate them into this supply chain, and really are able to, which allows them to supply this, to create this very much low-cost and effective UAV. So I would say that, they kind of, in a way, they have leaned on their shortcomings in a very intelligent way to, even if in some areas are able to self-produce some components, they prioritize, the ability to do it in a low cost and large scale way.
Yeah, they certainly seem to have specialized in a very economically, financially positive market, to focus on something that everybody needs more and more of, to provide yourself with all of the basic materials, and then anything that you don't or even don't want to produce inside, you go to some sort of illegal supply chain and procure things from the rest of the world. Is there any sign that this process is advancing towards becoming even more productive, or what is the likely future going to be in relation to the production of, and in particular, UAVs and missiles?
Yeah, what you see is that they have been, of course, they started with ballistic missile production, reverse engineering Soviet systems in the 80s, and they have been on a steady path developing more and more increasingly precise ballistic missiles. They have been, in recent years, improving the terminal guidance of their systems, with electro-optic guidance, with radar guidance systems. And in the last 20 years, from the 2000s, started to develop their cruise missile capabilities. So the aim would seem to be not only to have the capability of impose costs on third parties, but also to improve the accuracy of these systems. To have ever more increasing precise strike capabilities in a way that, for instance, in the case of the Red Sea, it allows them for a more effective, disruption effect, for example, of maritime trade, right?
Right.
And also, of course, of a more precise cost imposition strategy if you are going to attack, for example, Israel or other adversaries.
When it comes to how cutting edge are Iran's missile capabilities, I don't want to make direct comparisons between the missiles being produced in the United States or in Great Britain or France or China, but would they be considered by the rest of the world as being at the very forefront of development, or are they constantly playing catch up, or are they just going off on a different path on their own? How would you fit them into the overall scheme?
Well, I mean, I guess that of course in this particular case, more than perhaps other cases, the issue of propaganda and access to information is a problem. If you listen to the Iranian side, of course, their missiles are more advanced than any other, and maybe from the other side, it's the other way. But the fact is that we have had in the last year a very good show of these capabilities in the attacks against Israel, the April and the October attacks, and which were amazingly well, resisted by the US, the UK, and Israel, very much neutralized with a very low percentage of successful hits. So I think that I mean, they are not very, very precise systems, but they have been increasing their precision, and they have been able to manufacture them in large numbers, in part because again, they have concentrated their defense investment, which is not, by the way, that large, in the sense, I mean, in comparative terms. I mean, Iran has a $400 billion GDP. Their defense budget, I mean, maybe for procurement, the official numbers are about like $3 billion. Maybe it's more when, I mean, this is official, maybe they have unofficial sources of resources, but, we are not talking about, a particularly large defense. But going back to your point, what I would say is that, since they have focused on these systems, they have compensated the low quality or relative low quality and maybe decreasingly low quality with mass. And this is more the case in the UAVs, right? Where, the Shaheds are constantly being shot down in Ukraine. They also show very low performance, but they are effective in, creating, congesting the air defenses and imposing an economic cost in terms of having to,
Right.
launch, $1 million missiles to
Right.
counteract them. So
Right. You mentioned there that the the relative spending isn't actually that significant in terms of percentages related to the GDP, excuse me. Within the excuse me, within the population of Iran, is there resentment or frustration, or the other way, is there overall acceptance and support for the amount of money being spent on the military spending in a country where maybe there are other issues at a social level which are considered quite fundamental to the populations?
yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting point. I mean, of course, it's speculative, but I would say that I mean, the Iranian economy, I think, is one of the major obstacles for for increasingly develop their defense industry, because they have had for a large number of years a very, they have had problems in controlling their exchange rate. They have had multiple exchange rates. Actually, just this year, they have reformed their exchange rate regime. And after the US sanctions in 2018-19, when the US pulled out of the JCPOA, the so-called nuclear deal, they had a large currency devaluation. And if you remember, in that year, they also experienced a large protests in the streets, massive protests. Some of them also related to the place of women in their society. But, it was in a very bad economic context, macroeconomic context. And right now, they are experiencing a similar event, low oil prices, the return of Donald Trump to the White House, and their exchange rate regime has been reformed again. They have eliminated their kind of subsidized specific for exchange rate for trade, for imports, and they are attempting a unification with the free market exchange rate, which is much higher. So there's a huge, rise of the dollar, which is making imports more expensive and making, of course, life more expensive for Iranians. And this also hurts I mean, it creates a problem for defense projects because, I mean, of course, it hurts the defense budget. The most of the defense budget are personnel costs, like in most countries, like maybe around 50% of their defense budget is personnel. What I was referring to before are the numbers for acquisition, and procurement and R&D. But this creates a tension in the budget. You have to continue to pay wages, so there's less money for industrial projects, and this, of course, creates tensions with the rest of the needs of the society. The welfare needs. So yeah, of course, I think that as it happens in many other countries, the defense costs are not very much appreciated by impoverished societies.
How has Iran used its military industrial capacities as a foreign policy tool? Obviously, you've spoken a lot about how much it has exported and how often those exports have been used when it comes to low-cost missiles, etc. So, as a foreign policy tool, how has this been used to benefit Iran?
Well, I mean, certainly what is mostly reported is that Iran has supplied some of these low-cost systems to many of their allies and proxies in the Middle Eastern region, like traditionally Syria, Iraq, more recently the Houthis in Yemen, of course also Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah. Now Russia, which is not an ally, but they have kind of found a relationship around their defense, these defense projects. But I'd say that the more interesting aspect of this is how they are not only supplying off-the-shelf products or systems, but they are also kind of supplying assembly or manufacturing capability. They have found what many other countries have found, that, of course, trying to reduce their reliance on their own budget to sustain their military industries, and trying to increase revenue from other sources, and also to guarantee for themselves a demand base and a delocalized final assembly stages around their proxies, kind of like enhancing their proxies capabilities. So I'd say this is a very interesting development for a country like Iran. It's like they're not only leveraging their industrial might, but they're also being very smart in terms of, trying to have, partners that are also able to self-sustain themselves to a certain extent, of course.
Giving their clients the ability to produce for themselves, is it having a rebound effect? Are they receiving things in return with a similar approach from their proxies, or what's the benefit for Iran other than the most obvious, making somebody dependent on your system? What other benefits might they be getting? Are they getting stronger allies with surrounding them?
I mean, yeah, I think that there is some of that, but also I guess I think the most notable case here is the relationship with Russia, also with Tajikistan. They have also made a deal with them for locally manufacturing drones in Tajikistan as well as in Russia. But I think those deals are the ones that create more kind of interesting opportunities for them, because they are allowing them to resume, not only to create a revenue stream, of course, and also kind of like a demand base for components, but also the possibility to resume negotiations about other more advanced weapon systems. And in the case of Russia, there has been talk about acquiring, fighter jets and, anti-air missile systems and, capabilities that they are very much, outdated in their own arsenal. Which I think is also the other main point of disadvantage, that they have so much relied on this asymmetric strategy that they lack any meaningful like counter air and air defense capability that we have seen also last year with the how the Israel basically goes into their airspace, and they have also destroyed some manufacturing facilities, some solid propellant manufacturing facilities, and they really are unable to do anything about that. So they at some point they will need to improve their conventional military forces, their air force in particular, and the fact that this is so costly for most countries, and particularly for them, I think this is a major vulnerability area.
One final
Yeah.
big topic. I'm certain I know you've touched on it already by answering so many of those questions so well. The main challenges going forward for Iran's continuing development. You literally just now mentioned they are going to have to expand their focus. It seems to me, I might be wrong, but it seems to me like the narrowing of the focus was largely because of trying to make it, if at all possible, profitable in circumstances where international sanctions and embargoes made it extremely difficult for them to develop their entire military arsenal uniformly. So they had to cherry pick. And it seems that the cherry picking that they've done has worked out quite well for them. They certainly chose something that has become very necessary in any conflict situation. So what are, other than the issue of sanctions and embargoes, which are ongoing, what are the other challenges facing Iran moving forward?
Well, I mean, I think that I don't want to, repeat myself. I think that the main challenges are, we have discussed, in the sense that the macroeconomy, I think, is their main challenge. in this also in this low oil context, the effects of the macroeconomy in their own internal kind of political economy dilemmas. Uh, and in technological terms, I think that they are able to continue improving their missile systems, their drone systems, the feedback that they will get from their operational use, the access to increasingly lower cost technology. We have seen this trend all over the world, the proliferation of drones. I mean, these are not unsurmountable challenges. I think that the challenges will come from other areas, and the fact that they are not able to defend themselves from attacks that they will, delay their industrial projects, that creates an obvious vulnerability, even if they are, if they delocalize their production in proxies and everything, it's still, very difficult. You still need to have, facilities to manufacture like, explosive chemicals and certain components. And well, I mean, this context, I think, is one of the reasons that, there seem to be some, progress in negotiations with the West, although they still an agreement still seems far away. But I say that they are facing heavy pressure to make an arrangement. I mean, that said, if an arrangement is achieved, I think that they will continue to go down this path of improving their missile systems, and that of course creates a danger for their adversaries in the region.
Thank you very much indeed, Martin. I have to say I've enjoyed this. I'm by no means an expert on this topic, so it's very nice to have it explained to me in such understandable terms. I'd like to thank you again for your time and your expertise today. I wish you the very best, and I hope to see you soon.
Well, thank you so much, Connor, for your time, and I also hope to see you soon. Thank you.